Last week, we talked about the murder of Jean McPhaul. Jean was a realtor in Bossier City, Louisiana, who on April 27, 1982, was brutally murdered by a male client who called himself Dr. Zach. The murder seemed so planned out, so methodical, that investigators reached out to law enforcement across the nation, asking if they had encountered similar cases. What were the chances that the offender hadn't done this before? They found dozens of cases that were similar, including a murder in Barrington, Rhode Island that was nearly identical to that of Jean McPhaul. But this murder occurred in 1971, over 10 years before Jean was killed. Investigators wondered if the man had killed before, and now they wondered if they were dealing with a serial killer who had been active for decades. If you have listened to my last few episodes, you know that my ultimate goal in this series is to find out who killed Dorothy Miller in Burlington, Iowa in 1969. We've ruled out Charles Hatcher, and last week we introduced James Mike DeBardeleben, who was indicted but never tried for Jean McPhaul's murder. Today, we continue with the suspected victims of DeBardeleben. We are going to go back to the 1971 Rhode Island case that caught investigators' eye, a murder that occurred just 2 years after that of Dorothy Miller. Today, we are covering the murder of Edna Terry Macdonald. Let's get started. It was just before 8 p.m. on Thursday, April 29th, 1971, and Lynn McDonald was irritated. Lynn, a newly engaged 22-year-old, was waiting for her mom, Edna Macdonald, who most people called Terry, to get home from work. Terry, 52 years old, was a real estate agent working at Child's Realty in Barrington, Rhode Island, which is near Providence, and she had an appointment that evening to show a male client a couple of homes. That night, it was just Lynn and her 17-year-old sister Sue at home. Their dad, Jack, was in Chicago on a business trip, and the other McDonald kids, 22-year-old Chip and 19-year-old Debbie, didn't live at home anymore. Chip was in the military and stationed in Japan, and Debbie had recently moved to Boston. Now, Lynn was feeling irritated because Terry had promised her that they would go shopping that evening for bridesmaids' gifts, and Terry's evening appointment was taking way longer than anticipated. Terry was set to meet the client, who lived out of town, at his hotel in Providence around 4:30 or 5 p.m. But just before 6 p.m., Terry called their home and Sue picked up. Terry said that the client, a guy named Peter Morgan, was nowhere to be found and she was about to give up. She told Sue that if the guy called the home looking for her, to take down his location. Well, just 10 minutes later, Terry called back and said she found Peter as she was driving out of the parking lot, and that now the two of them were going to go look at those houses. Well, just before 8 p.m., and I'm guessing Lynn figured her mom would be done by then, and probably should have been done way sooner, Terry pulled into their driveway and ran inside through the rain to grab a flashlight and a measuring tape. She told Lynn, quote, "This'll be quick. I'll be right back." And she ran back out to her car and left again with Peter Morgan. Sue could see the man sitting in the car from her upstairs window. Now, I can definitely see why Lynn would be irritated, and though I don't know this for sure, but I would also be irritated if I was Terry. I mean, you're set to meet this guy around 5 p.m., you wait for an hour, it's raining, your kids are waiting for you, you have plans, and when you finally find him, you show him some homes, but then you have to run home for a flashlight and a measuring tape and then go back. I would not be having it. And she had already shown Peter at least one house by this point where she's coming back to get the flashlight. It belonged to a woman named Marlene Lawler. He, I guess, wanted to see other homes, vacant ones specifically, and those didn't have electricity, which is why Terry needed the flashlight. But Lynn's irritation eventually turns to worry when hours go by and their mom hasn't returned home. Sue was already sleeping by then, but it's past 10 p.m. and their mom still hadn't arrived, and she hadn't even called to check in. Lynn was worrying, especially with the weather being super rainy, storming. She was worried that maybe her mom had been in a car accident or something. By midnight, Lynn had called police in both Providence and Barrington, but she got the distinct feeling that they weren't treating it with any urgency. Lynn woke up Sue, told her that their mom wasn't home yet, and Sue also wasn't worried about it and thought maybe Terry had gone out with friends. Now, I don't know if this was something Terry would normally do, but at this point, even though Lynn was worrying, neither were thinking that it was any sort of worst case scenario or that anything nefarious would have happened to her. But by 2 a.m, Lynn was still worried, and their mom still wasn't home. She woke up Sue again, and the two decided to call some family friends, Jim and Lynn Sweat, who lived nearby, and the two of them came straight to the McDonald house to help. Jim started making some calls. He was trying to get a hold of Jack in Chicago, and was also trying to figure out who this client, Peter Morgan, was. Now, I don't know exactly who they called, but Beyond Cruel says that once the, quote, most obvious and innocent explanations for her disappearance had been checked out and discarded, an official search for Terry with police began around noon on Friday. And despite Lynn believing that police weren't taking it seriously when she initially called, an article published in the Staten Island Sunday Advance on May 2nd, 1971, has a quote from the police chief at the time, Stanley Gontars, and he said police suspected murder right from the beginning when she was reported missing. He's quoted as saying, "We felt it was foul play because she was not the type of person to walk off and not call." Now, it's unclear to me exactly what order the search went in, but at some point, police check out the hotel that Terry met the client at, which was the Sheraton Biltmore Hotel in Providence. There, the night doorman, a man named Norman, told police he saw Terry when she arrived at the hotel lobby around 5 p.m. Norman said Terry sat around for about an hour and that she had asked Norman to page Peter Morgan, which he did, but he never showed up from what he could see. I'm guessing Norman didn't see Terry pick up Peter Morgan as she was driving out, but they at least have someone who can verify where she was at a set time. Police continue their search. They got a list from Child's Realty of the 3 houses they believed Terry planned to show Peter. One detective, Robert Casal, checked one of the homes thoroughly and found nothing, so moved on to the second. The second home, located at 24 Heritage Road in Barrington, was just a 5-minute drive from Terry's own house. When Casal got there, he wasn't able to get inside. Apparently, Terry had taken the only key the realty office had to the home, and the home was now locked, so he couldn't get in. Casal peered through windows, but didn't see anything. The home appeared empty. Casal walked across the street to the only house that apparently had people living in it and asked them if they had seen anything. The residents of the home said they knew Terry and saw her the previous evening with a man, but that they also saw her leave. Casal later said he, quote, kind of relaxed on that house for a while. It appeared she'd been there, but left. So he couldn't get into the second house, and for some reason that I haven't found in my research, he said he also wasn't able to get into the third. Casal had gotten to work at 8:30 that morning, and Beyond Cruel says that throughout the day, in addition to trying to check out the houses, he had also worked on other parts of the investigation. By 8:30 that night, he got back to the police station and was presumably getting ready to head home for the day, but he had developed this nagging feeling. He was quoted as saying, "I just felt uncomfortable going home. I needed to look inside those 2 houses to feel as if I'd taken care of my assignment the way I should have." Casal was then able to get in touch with the builder of the 24 Heritage Road home and asked the contractor if he had an extra key to the house. Now, I don't really understand why this wasn't done earlier. I mean, maybe they did try to get a hold of the builder and weren't able to reach him. I don't know. But Casal was able to get a key, and he and Reverend Bernard Norman, who apparently acted as some sort of unofficial chaplain to the police department, went back to 24 Heritage Road. Both Casal and the Reverend go into the house with flashlights, and they check the first floor thoroughly. I mean, looking in chimneys thoroughly. They got into the kitchen and saw there was a stairway that led upstairs and another that led into the basement. Casal is quoted in the book as saying, "The Reverend headed down, and I headed up. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the Reverend make this horrifying groan. He didn't say anything, he just kind of groaned. I turned around, pulled my gun out, and came running downstairs. I saw him standing at the bottom of the stairs with his head cradled in his band. I'm saying, 'Norm, what's up, what's up?' He's just kind of moaning and groaning, not really saying anything intelligible. Cassell asks again, "What's the matter?" And then, quote, "Without turning his head, he pointed back to the opposite side of the house. I turned around and scanned where he was pointing with my flashlight. The first time, I almost passed her over. It looked like a pile of rags. I didn't recognize it as a body. Then the second time, I had to focus on it because it just wouldn't click that there was a human being." There, in the basement of 24 Heritage Road, was Edna Terry Macdonald. She was completely clothed and lying on her back near the far wall. A cord had been looped around an overhead pipe and then tied around her neck, which was lifted a few inches off the basement floor. Dr. Joseph Palumbo from Providence, Rhode Island, performed Terry's autopsy. Palumbo reported no signs of sexual assault. There was a bruise on her head, and several fingernails had been broken. Marks on her wrists and her mouth indicated she was bound and gagged with some sort of tape. Bits of this tape were found near her body. What was described as a cord being looped around her neck and a pipe in the basement ceiling turned out to be a part of the nylon pantyhose she was wearing. The nylon on her right leg had been torn off and used. Ultimately, the pathologist and investigators believe that the assailant hit her in the head as she got into the basement, but the blow wasn't enough to kill her. They aren't sure if she ever regained her senses, and they think the broken fingernails were caused by her falling to the ground as opposed to her fighting off her attacker. How they came to that conclusion, I'm not sure. But her ultimate cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. Now, one interesting part from the autopsy was that Dr. Palumbo was certain that Terry had died on her stomach. And there are ways that can be determined, but if you remember, Terry was found on her back. So their theory is that the offender, and at this point they are definitely assuming it's Peter Morgan, the client, got her down into the basement, probably under the pretense that he wanted something measured, which is why she went back to the home to get the measuring tape. He then struck her in the head, she falls to the ground, breaks her fingernails. He then binds and gags her with tape. He strangles her with her nylons, and after she was dead, he then positioned her on her back and tied the nylon to the ceiling pipe. He then, I suppose, would have had to have taken the tape off of her. Now, investigators were obviously focusing their attention on finding out anything they could about Peter Morgan, this mystery client who had seemingly vanished. And investigators didn't believe that Terry was the only realtor Peter Morgan had targeted. Over the course of their investigation, they learned that early in the month of April 1971, a man began appearing at multiple realty offices in the Barrington area. While the man went by several different names like Charles Murray, Peter Rogers, Peter Fuller, and ultimately Peter Morgan, investigators came to believe that he was the same person. This is because the realtors he met with, all women as far as I know, all had similar descriptions of the man and said he was looking for similar homes. He was described as being smooth-shaven, white, 5'8" to 5'10", and up to 175 pounds. They said his hair was dark and neatly groomed with long sideburns, and that he was always well-dressed. The man told the various realtors he met with that he was wanting to see newly built and unoccupied homes, preferably colonials, in the $40,000 to $50,000 range. Barrington police detective Louis Gelfuso is quoted in the book Beyond Cruel as saying, quote, "He was probably alone at some point with all of them, but with the younger ones he never placed follow-up calls or made follow-up visits. I think he was in search of a particular type, a particular look, and a particular personality. And the only one he seriously followed up on was Edna." And in this case, Peter Morgan played the long game. He seemingly scoped out numerous realtors in Barrington before specifically picking Terry. Despite Terry being murdered on April 29th, her first meeting with Peter was actually way back on April 2nd. That morning, Peter Morgan showed up at Child's Realty without an appointment to inquire about homes. He spoke with Terry that morning, and she wrote down his information on an office form. Her note stated that Peter was from Union, New Jersey. He had a wife and family and needed a 3-bedroom home and specified new houses, not usual colonials, and was willing to pay up to $60,000. According to the book Beyond Cruel, Terry might have shown Peter a few homes that morning. I'm not sure if this was in person or if they had printouts and they just stayed in the office. So that was on April 2nd. And now I don't know what type of contact they had in the weeks after that, but on April 27th, an employee at Child's Realty got a call from Peter who said he was in Nashua, New Hampshire, and that he was looking to set up an appointment with Terry on the 29th. He specifically requested an evening appointment and said he would meet her at the Sheraton Biltmore Hotel in Providence at 5 p.m. on Thursday, the 29th. During the initial investigation, they had no luck tracking down Peter Morgan. They also hadn't found Terry's car. If you remember, Terry met Peter Morgan at the Sheraton. They went to show some homes. She stopped at her house to grab the flashlight and the measuring tape, and all of this was in her vehicle. That neighbor across the street also said he saw Terry leave. It seems like he probably didn't actually see her leave, but saw her go in with the client and then either saw her car leave or looked back and saw her car was gone and just assumed she had left. Well, an article published on May 3rd in the Staten Island Advance said police eventually found her car in Providence, about 10 miles from the home she showed Peter Morgan and where she was murdered. In the article, it says investigators have no way of knowing if the car was driven to Providence before or after she was killed. I think it's pretty safe to assume it was driven there after, almost certainly by Peter Morgan. Now, I've gone through the book Beyond Cruel, and I've looked at newspaper archives covering Terry's case, of which there are very few, and I haven't found anything definitively saying where they found the car, the state it was in, and if they collected any evidence. Nothing. The article is talking about authorities finding it was published on Sunday, May 3rd. Terry was murdered on Thursday, April 29th, and found the evening of Friday, April 30th. I'm assuming that the Sheraton, where she met Peter Morgan, was looked at on Friday during the search for her. And if the newspaper publishing it has this article coming out on Sunday, my guess is they found the car Saturday, and that the car wasn't at the Sheraton because then they probably would have found it by then when they were looking for her on Friday. That's just my guess and me thinking out loud. But like I said before, there were very few articles on Terry's murder in the days following her killing. What I do know is that there was very little to go on. There was the description of Peter Morgan. They did, I believe, get a sketch out, but there were no fingerprints left behind and no other useful pieces of physical evidence. Otherwise, I really have no information on how the investigation went, if they ever had any major leads, but ultimately, no arrests were ever made, and it was well on its way to being a cold case, if they didn't already consider it cold. And just like in last week's episode with the murder of Jean McPhaul, it seemed cold until Mike DeBardeleben came into the picture. In a few weeks, I will have an episode specific to him, his upbringing, and how he got on investigators' radar, but he was connected to Terry's case after he was connected to Jean McPhaul's. In Beyond Cruel, which I will link in the show notes if you want to purchase it, but in 1984, 13 years after Terry was murdered, the book says that Detective Payne from Bossier City, Louisiana, one of the detectives on Jean's case, had heard about Terry's case in Barrington all those years prior. He is quoted as saying, "When I first heard of the Barrington case, I called up there and tried to get information. I told them, look, I believe the same guy that killed our agent down here is going to be the one that killed yours. Would you please check into it?" Now, the Barrington police were aware of Jean's murder in Bossier City within weeks of it happening in 1982, but it's unclear if they ever contacted them to discuss the similarities. But it wasn't until 1984, after DeBardeleben was caught, and when I'm assuming Detective Payne reached out, that they began looking into him as a suspect. And even though there was no physical evidence to tie him to the scene of Terry's murder, there was quite a bit placing him in Barrington, Rhode Island. For one, a woman who worked at another realty office in Barrington identified DeBardeleben as the man she met in early April 1971, going by the name Charles Murray. A woman who worked with Terry at Child's Realty identified DeBardeleben and said she remembered him from his initial visit with Terry on April 2nd, 1971. Another real estate agent and her coworker in Barrington identified DeBardeleben as Peter Fuller, a potential client who visited them just 8 days before Terry was murdered. And then there was Marlene Lawler. She was living in a home in Barrington that Terry showed Peter Morgan that night, before Terry went home to get the flashlight and measuring tape. Marlene said she got a good look at Peter Morgan, and 13 years later, she didn't so much as hesitate when presented with a photo lineup. She picked out Mike DeBardeleben. On October 26, 1984, the Rhode Island State Attorney General's office announced that a grand jury had indicted DeBardeleben for the murder of Edna Terry Macdonald. However, just like in Jean McPhaul's case, they never bring him to trial. DeBardeleben was convicted in other cases in other states, and it was guaranteed that the rest of his life would be spent behind bars. And by the time those other convictions occurred, prosecutors in Rhode Island decided to not bring it to trial. Probably for the same reasons cited in Jean's case: cost to the taxpayer, logistics, all of that. But those aren't satisfying answers for the victims' families. And just like with Jean's case, no one contacted Terry's family to discuss this decision with them before they made it. Terry's daughter Lynn is quoted as saying, "We all assumed that one day he'd be tried for murder in Rhode Island. In fact, we were told it might be right after the Maryland trial, because he'd do anything to avoid going to Louisiana, where they have the death penalty. So you could say I was a little shocked and disappointed when they called me to say there wasn't going to be a trial." So, once again, a disappointing ending to another case. I'm sure there are some out there who would be fine at least knowing that he was spending his life behind bars for those other crimes. But he murdered multiple people, and though was convicted of many other things, he was never convicted of any murder. He should be a convicted killer. It just seems like the right thing to do, to at least try. Now, looking at this case, it's clear how authorities investigating the murder of Jean McPhaul were interested in this one. There are so many similarities between the two cases. And we talked about the similarities and differences between Dorothy's murder and Jean's in the last episode. And those stand when comparing Dorothy's to Terry's. The main differences being Dorothy wasn't hung in the way that Terry and Jean were. Dorothy was sexually assaulted, while Terry and Jean were not. Dorothy was stabbed 22 times. Jean was stabbed twice, and Terry wasn't stabbed at all. But otherwise, you have all three of these women being contacted by a male client. Fake name, similar backstory, wanting to see empty homes, moving to the area with family, all of that. In all three cases, the women picked up the client. He never drives his own vehicle to the scene of the murder. And in all three cases, the perpetrator seemingly drives the victim's car away from the scene and immediately leaves the area. One similarity, though, that stuck out to me when researching Terry's case, and it's something I hadn't really thought about, was the age of Terry, Jean, and Dorothy. Terry was a 52-year-old woman and mother, Jean was a 40-year-old woman and mother, and Dorothy was a 48-year-old woman and mother. Now, I don't know if the offender in each of these cases knew the victims were mothers, but all three victims were middle-aged and all were white women. While reading Beyond Cruel, Barrington, Rhode Island investigators had consulted with Dr. James Brussel, a New York-based psychiatrist and scholar in deviant criminal behavior. Brussel provided what you could consider to be a criminal profile of the offender in Terry's case, and provided the following insight, quote, "The subject has had a problem, possibly with his mother, identifies the victim with his mother, and has a hostility for the victim." Investigators on Terry's case eventually met with the Secret Service when all of these cases were being tied to DeBardeleben. The book Beyond Cruel says that spring in 1984, detectives Gelfuso and Gary Palumbo were provided a full DeBardeleben tutorial, as well as access to the recovered evidence. For Gelfuso, the investigation's defining moment arrived on this visit to the Secret Service. As he was sifting through some photographs, he first saw a snapshot of Mary Lou DeBardeleben, Mike DeBardeleben's mother. Gelfuso said, quote, "When I saw that, it was like, wow, this is it. I could not believe the similarity. His mother and Terry Macdonald looked just alike. This is why, I thought, he searched out someone so he could take out his hatred for his mother." Now, I cannot, for the life of me, find a picture of Edna Terry Macdonald closer to the age that she was at when she died, so I haven't been able to compare the pictures of her with Mike DeBardeleben's mother. And I just want to say, I know it's kind of a hallmark with serial killers. Everyone always says they all have problems with their mothers. I mean, I think this is definitely true in some of the cases, but I think some people are quick to use that as the reason for why they became a serial killer. And to me, that's kind of just a cop-out and putting all the blame on moms out there, which is kind of irritating to me. I think there could be a lot of different factors, but I do think it's interesting when you're looking at the similarities between Terry, Jean, and Dorothy, that they were all in their middle ages. Jean was 40 years old, so the youngest, and they were all white women and mothers. So there definitely could be something to this. One other similarity that I thought of as I was going through and recording this is that in Dorothy's case, Robert Clark also specifically requested an evening appointment, and he did that with Terry as well. Now, he didn't do that with Jean. He met Jean in the morning, and they went and viewed some homes in the afternoon. So that one was kind of more midday. With Terry and Dorothy, an evening appointment was specifically requested. So I think that's definitely an interesting similarity. Now, like I said before, I will put Stephen Michaud's book, Beyond Cruel, in the show notes if you want to purchase it. It has a lot of information on Mike DeBardeleben, his suspected victims, all of that. And next week, we are going to continue with another suspected victim of DeBardeleben's, but one that he was never actually indicted for. So stay tuned, and we will see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself. If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off, and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode.